One of the mental hurdles I have with startups is how to think about time. Some will say time is your enemy and you have to move as fast as possible, especially to get first mover advantage. And then there's a whole other camp that says time is your best friend and that you should take your time. Run a marathon, not a sprint. So for my own mental clarity that can hopefully help others in this same predicament, I wanted to create this video on how I'm starting to approach time and show how other successful ventures have grown, particularly how they grew to $1 million in annual revenue. Without further ado, let's jump into how time should be your friend, not an enemy, and then go through a few examples of companies that followed what I think is a pretty healthy timeline. Let's start out on feeling the need to move fast so you have first mover advantage. The reality is that first mover advantage is really first mover disadvantage. As Adam Grant puts it, you have a disadvantage because you spend your time creating the market and getting people used to this idea, and then someone else can swoop in and make it better. There are plenty of examples of being too early. MySpace, Blockbuster, or even Clubhouse. Facebook, Netflix, and Twitter Spaces came in after these and have done even better. So in reality, you should feel good if you're late to the party or late in coming to an industry. You know what they say, good things come to those who wait. And as history has told us, that holds true in startups. The other way to think about it that I've personally felt more in practice is infinite versus finite games. There's plenty of content around them, specifically with Simon Sinek's book of the Infinite Game, but when you can take a long-term approach rather than trying to make a decision purely for the short term, you can typically make a better decision. For me, that's looked like how I want to monetize. A little different since I'm not building a startup per se, but one decision is that I don't want to sell my time when it comes to this venture. I could make a more short-term decision with consulting projects and that kind of work, but that would take me away from what I want to do in the long term, which is creating content and community building. The long-term approach to building looks different for everyone, but if you're trying to build a startup with a ton of revenue in year one, the chances of you being successful are much lower. For some perspective, according to Adam Grant, if you keep your full-time job and start your business as a hobby or a side hustle at first, you are 33% less likely to fail. However, building your startup as a side hustle for multiple years definitely sucks. So how much time does it take in reality to make a $1 million revenue per year business? I don't have any scientific study or perfect science around this, but from everything I've seen and read in preparing for this video, it takes a few years. Sure, you could go viral on TikTok, but those are the exception. In no particular order, I want to dive into two different businesses that achieved $1 million in revenue per year: Spanx and Buffer. Spanx is an activewear brand for women. I can't attest to any of their clothing items, but their founder, Sarah Blakely, has done some really amazing work in and outside of Spanx. Definitely someone I recommend studying up on a little bit. For me, the story of Spanx caught my eye as they never raised venture capital, but in 2021 was able to sell the majority of it at a $1.2 billion valuation. With that, Sarah obviously was much richer, but surprised the entire team with 2 first-class tickets each to anywhere in the world and $10,000 each to spend on that vacation. Obviously, $1.2 billion is a lot different than $1 million in revenue though. So let's jump back into the early days of Spanx. Spanx started with Sarah working a 9-to-5 sales job and putting aside $5,000 to start the business when she was 27. She spent 2 years working on the product launch. So yes, 2 years before even seeing a single cent of revenue. However, things changed fast after that launch. Sarah was able to line up a meeting with buyers from Neiman Marcus, and she was able to convince them to place an initial order. From there, she was able to get other retailers such as Bloomingdale's and Saks. An endorsement from Oprah didn't hurt either. A couple things to point out here in terms of timeline. 1, 2 years of product development for a physical product isn't crazy. Physical goods are tough. Even just clothing and getting the custom designs right takes a lot of time and resources. Once you have all the designs right, you then need to figure out manufacturing and where you're storing and shipping everything. Product development for a physical good like this isn't something that just comes together overnight. 2, Sarah wasn't ready to leave her full-time job until 2 weeks before Oprah did the endorsement of Spanx. She was selling and shipping goods at night while working her full-time job. She didn't try to go raise money or take this super risky move to start Spanx. It was methodical and took a lot of time. If you're keeping track of how long it took to get to $1 million in annual revenue for Spanx, let's say it was about 2.5 years in. For a physical product company, that's a pretty reasonable timeline. For those that are thinking that software companies can get to $1 million faster, you're not necessarily wrong, but you're not necessarily correct either. Let's move on to a software company, the social media management platform, Buffer. Buffer allows you to schedule and manage any content you are posting on social media platforms. Originally it was just for Twitter, but now it's for a whole slew of platforms. Buffer started when their founder, Joel Gascoigne, was writing regularly on Twitter and found himself just writing out a schedule of when he was going to tweet. Similar to Sarah, Joel was working a full-time job as a freelance software developer and started Buffer as a side hustle. A key difference is that Joel was able to stop doing his freelance work at the 6-month mark of Buffer. Buffer had revenue within its first week of existing. Small caveat to that though. Joel had an audience on Twitter as he was posting on Twitter for 1.5 years before Buffer existed. He didn't have a huge following, but it was an engaged audience of 1,700 people that led to his first users on Buffer. Now, fast forward to the time it took Buffer to make $1 million in a year, it wasn't until about halfway through 2016 that Buffer had an annual revenue rate of $1 million. That's about 3.5 years from when they first started. One of the cool things about Buffer is that they are incredibly transparent, so you can take a look at all the revenue numbers and dig in if you wish. The link to their numbers is in the description down below. If you consider the 1.5 years of developing a small audience on Twitter and 3.5 years after Buffer started, it took Buffer about 5 years to be $1 million in revenue per year business. So yes, you can get revenue faster as a software company, but it doesn't mean that you can become $1 million business faster in the long run compared to a physical goods business like Spanx. They both have growth limitations. If I've learned anything though, it's that great businesses take a ton of time to really get going. Spanx and Buffer are just 2 test cases and there are millions more. Are there exceptions? Of course. For the vast majority of businesses though, take your time, think long term, and stay focused on the mission. If you found this video helpful, I would love it if you can give it a like. And if you're looking for more content like this, you can check out other videos on this channel like this one here.